Hello, my name is John Rose, and in this video I'd like to take a closer look at the possibility of whether or not we have become dependent upon some of our mistakes and whether or not we're using those mistakes as an excuse to keep making the mistakes. And the sad reality to that question is, yes, some of us have become dependent upon our mistakes, and yes, some of us will use that as an excuse to keep making our mistakes. Now, what am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about specifically are what's known as level 2 nutrients that healthy people are supposed to make if we get all of our needs, if we satisfy all of our needs. The problem here is that we're not satisfying all of our needs, and when that happens, we damage ourselves, and that's what creates this other group of needs. That's how we become dependent upon certain level 2 nutrients. The classic example that's taken millennium to happen, which can also happen over a shorter period of time with other level 2 nutrients, but the classic example is what happened in Norway, where they've been eating so much fish for a millennium that they've been getting a direct source of DHA, which is one of those level 2 nutrients that healthy people can make if they have the right omega-3 omega-6 ratio, which most of us don't, even vegetarians. It's easy to eat unnatural food and create an imbalance there. So what happened to these people from Norway is that they've been eating so much DHA directly from their fish, their body is atrophied, and it can no longer make that level 2 nutrient. So now they have another group of needs that's based on not the law of cause and effect, but the ripple effect. Remember, there's 2 types of anatomical limitations. One we're given at birth, because we're living systems and subject to this law of cause and effect. And then there's the other set of anatomical limitations that we get from making mistakes that have damaged ourselves. So we can damage ourselves by giving it something that it's supposed to make, and then it atrophies and no longer can make it, you see? So it's easy to become dependent upon some of our mistakes. And the mistake I'm talking about now would be mistake number 2. If you watched any of my videos, you'll have heard me say this many times. There are 5 main mistakes we're making that are causing most of our problems. And they all have to do with 5 things that we mastered, and then we made bad applications. So when we mastered animals, we made a bad application by eating them, just in the same way we mastered plants, the agricultural revolution, and started eating plants that we weren't biologically adapted to eat. You see, this is why we suffer. And the reason why there's so much confusion around nutrition is because food is actually a weapon system. It's the means by which the status quo remains the status quo. Because we've been eating the wrong food for a long time, which means if we're going to stay where we are, we've got to keep eating the wrong food. Don't you see? It doesn't even have to be a conspiracy, although, trust me, there are a lot of people getting together making sure this system and way of life continues. Because the whole system would come down, the whole structure would come down if we corrected this one big mistake and start eating natural food, which in this case, there are 5 main mistakes underneath that one mistake. So the big mistake, we're eating unnatural food, and I've identified at least 5 main mistakes. Now we're making a lot more mistakes, obviously, but these 5 main mistakes have to do with things that we mastered. And with all new knowledge comes the potential for evil whenever we apply the things we master to the things we need. I've gone over this many times in other videos, and I never know when this might be the very first video someone's watching of mine. And I'm sure that's going to be happening years from now all the time. So that means there's 10 main events right there that have drastically changed the fate of mankind. And it was all made possible when our brains nearly doubled in size. Now, some people are trying to say that our first bad application is what made our brains double in size, but that has everything in the reverse order. We had to have a brilliant brain before we could master something, let alone make a bad application from it. So it's absurd to think that that a mistake is what made us great. It made our brains bigger and smarter. No, that's not how it happened. It doesn't even make sense. It's not in the right chronological sequence when you think of how things work logically. So how do we make sense out of all this? I'm convinced there's really only one way to understand that whether or not we become dependent upon something, and that is to correct all 5 of these mistakes on a temporary basis. And that's where the first of my three-step process comes into play. Go to the description box down below and you'll find a link that takes you to a seminar I gave on how to do this. And when you do this, if you don't feel on top of the world, then there's a good chance you become dependent upon something, and you're going to have to supplement your body, support your body, because you've damaged it somehow. Or it may have been given to you damaged. You might have gotten some junk birth defects, but that's in a very small percentage of cases where that's actually the main cause. Usually genes only determine how we get sick, not if we get sick. It's always the lifestyle choices that will determine if something manifests. Where it manifests and how it manifests depends upon us individually. So there is a oneness of disease and a uniqueness of disease. The oneness of disease is based on the anatomical limitations that we've all been given at birth. I think I may have read somewhere long ago someone actually had gills, but otherwise most of us have lungs, and we're limited to where we can get our oxygen, just like the fish are limited where they can get their oxygen. So we've been given anatomical limitations. And this illustrates just how powerful denial is when there are about a dozen anatomical characteristics that determine where every animal fits. And humans are no different, but for some reason we don't want to look at the evidence, or some people don't. But when you look at the evidence, there are 12 characteristics that clearly tell us that we're meant to eat plants. And now you might want to argue some of them, but there's one you can't argue, and that's the length of our intestines, and that's the most important part of it. I've done several videos on bowel transit time and understanding how things are taking too long that go through our food tube, and that's what's causing so many of our problems, because we've got crap inside of our body that we carry around with us all the time. It contributes to why we suffer so much. It backs up, and as many people say, death begins in the colon. It damages the kidneys can't filter the lymph system. Most of our diseases happen when the lymph system simply backs up into the tissues. Now, what's one of the best ways to get the lymph fluid moving and clean the kidneys? A high fruit diet. So now what do we have? We have advice from people who have become dependent upon animal products. They have cognitive bias. They can find as many studies as they want to support what they think is true, because the people who rule the world use food as a weapon system, and I can guarantee you they're the people who are responsible for all this misinformation out there, just like there was misinformation about the tobacco industry. And yet I heard something interesting the other day about that, but I won't go into it. Nonetheless, it just goes to show that we can't trust our experts, we can't trust our belief system, and we should question everything, especially what I say. And there's only one way to question what I say. That's to test an idea as time has come. That's where you go down in the description box below, if you haven't done so already, and do the first of my three-step process. The decision is always the hardest part about doing anything. If you haven't done it yet, I understand this is a little overwhelming, and a lot of people are not in a position to really evaluate whether it's going to be a fair trade or not. But I've done this over 1,200 days in the last 24 years, and I do it frequently because I know I need to, because I live in a very polluted environment. I eat very healthfully, but everything around me is polluted. And I also do it to remind myself it's actually more fun than actually putting in solid food all the time. It's a nice thing to do to give your body a break. And I always like what Daniel Goleman said in his book, Emotional IQ, that the number one factor that determines our emotional IQ is our ability to delay gratification. So I like to look at my first step as a way to learn how to delay gratification, because we're going to have cravings during this process, and we got to be strong for just 5 or 10 minutes, because that's about how long they last, and that will give us an opportunity to grow emotionally. And of course, this life is an illusion. What appears to be a sacrifice is not a sacrifice at all. What appears to be abundance is a sacrifice. What appears to be abundance is actually what causes this whole false belief in scarcity. Eating the wrong food is what creates the wrong mentality. That's what creates the money system. That's what creates this illusion of scarcity. It's all connected to our food. It's amazing how doing something as simple as correcting our diet can change so many solve so many problems. I know I digress a lot. I start off on one subject and I go all over the place. I digress because these pieces are connected. I really believe that we can't really appreciate the knowledge we need and even understand how we've become dependent upon our mistakes unless we realize that there are people who want us to do these things. And they're going to use a trick that the old Pharaoh, it was a favorite form of the pharaohs they used a long time ago to keep the slaves enslaved. And it was to get us to fight amongst ourselves. Divide and conquer. I've said this before in videos. If you want to really understand how the world works, create a file on psychopaths, watch Defense Against a Psychopath, and they'll explain the MO of a psychopath. And it's divide and conquer. That's the main thing they do. You see, it's all about being distracted. That's how, in fact, life is one big con. If that's one thing I've concluded after 26 years of extensive research and analysis, is that life is one big con. It's a big magic act. The people who rule the world are magicians. All they do is they trick us. Don't look over here, look over here. What? Which way? You know which hand I want you to look at now, do you? See, it's all a magic act. And then it's divide and conquer. So what happens with the people who rule the world and the way they operate is they finance both sides of the war. They finance people to start a war and then they attack that person. Now, some people knew that was happening. They took advantage of it and they broke away from it, and now they've been demonized as a result of that. But it's important to understand how money is used as a tool of control and how the people who rule the world, that own and control everything, so they can control what we believe and how we think. They can initiate arguments between both sides of everything. They get us to divide and conquer on every level imaginable. Color, race, religion, nutrition. That's why if you want to look for evidence that will support eating your high-fat diet so you can lose weight, you'll have plenty of evidence out there because the people want you to believe that crap. It's not how we're designed to eat. How would we eat that in nature? Did we evolve eating a high-fat diet? Hell no, it's ridiculous. It boggles my mind that people can accept certain diets just because some people get results. Now, there's a reason why people get results on different diets. Some people are dependent on the mistakes they made, so they can't break away from that mistake. So there's one reason right there. But a lot of it has to do with our ancestry. I mentioned this before. Some people can tolerate gluten better, and some people can tolerate lactose better because their ancestors ate more of those. But just because we can tolerate a food does not make us impervious to the danger from eating food we're not biologically adapted to eat. Another interesting factor that can make one person successful on a high-fat or a low-fat diet has to do with whether or not they are what I would call a low-carbohydrate burner or a high-carbohydrate burner. 28 years ago, I started to write a book on weight loss because I can prove mathematically how to lose fat. I figured out how to keep track of my carbohydrate fuel tank. The biggest problem I had writing my book was explaining it and making it simple enough for the average person to use it, because I knew the average person would probably take 6 hours a day to go through the calculations. Knowing 10 keep I touch, I could whip through it in a couple hours, but even then I realized the drawback to it, and I knew some people would want to know that. If you were making a living doing this, you would definitely want to know it. That's why I perfected it, because that's what I was doing with it. But anyway, one of the things I did to make my book finish, I actually was able to finish the book. I didn't publish it because I found it was a joke in its own way, because I didn't have enough pieces of the puzzle. But what I had done is I created tables where people were either low, medium, or high carbohydrate burners. And what I realized that most people, on an average, are going to fit between 40 to 60% carbohydrate burning. But it can be as extreme to 30 to 70. And that's easy to figure out. Once you understand how things work, you can put extremes in there and say, I'll use 0 here and 100 here, then I'll use 100 here and 0 here, and what do I got? The extremes, 30 and 70, you see? So that's how I came up with the extremes, but then I also know that most people aren't going to be extreme. They're going to be more in that middle range. But you can see with an extreme range of 30% versus 70%, that's a huge difference in how many calories you need from carbohydrates. When you look at the average diet most people eat, it's right at 50% carbs, 50% fat, real close to it, or 40, 20, or whatever it is, something like that. And if we're eating too much food, then carbohydrates usually won't be an issue. But if you're going to lose weight successfully, you have to protect your lean body mass. There's only 2 ways to do that. One is to keep your carbohydrate fuel tank full and eat the food you're supposed to, which is high in carbohydrates, or you let it empty and then you eat food you're not supposed to eat that's high in protein, and then the body eats the other dead animal flesh you're eating instead of your own flesh. Okay, I can prevent gluconeogenesis, just give me some dead animal flesh so I can be in the graveyard of a murdered beast. Oh, you people don't know the evil things you do when you eat an animal. And if you had to eat it, it wouldn't be evil, would it? Oh, look at that bee fly around my limbs. I can't wait to watch that. That was an up-close shot of that bee flying right smack in front of my camera. Anyway, where was I on that one? Okay. So you can see how certain diets are going to work for certain people. And again, you don't want to consume more animal protein than you need to prevent gluconeogenesis. It works, and yeah, you can lose fat doing this. Why would people be successful on that type of diet? Because it takes a long time to digest fat. When you're eating a high-fat diet, your stomach is always full, so you feel satisfied. It works from the point of view of not wanting to eat. You don't have that all-gone feeling in your stomach, but that's the thing most of us don't understand, is that we are under a hunger spell. That when we eat unnatural foods, it damages our system, and we become dependent upon it like a drug, and we have withdrawal symptoms. So how do we know if we become dependent upon our mistakes? If you feel hunger in your belly, then you are dependent upon your mistakes. And I did 2 videos on the hunger spell. I'll add that down below in the link. So what happens when we eat unnatural food? It's just like taking a drug. Our body gets addicted to it. It wants to be fed, just like the cigarette smoker wants another cigarette and the alcoholic wants another drink. It's no different. The heroin addict, it's no different. Hunger is nothing but a morbid sensation to feed unnatural food. True hunger is a watering of the throat. There's that bee. He's just buzzing around my dog a second ago, that's why I stared down. So that's not natural. We're not supposed to have an all-gone feeling in our stomach. Why do people fear fasting? I know what they're thinking. It feels horrible when we miss one meal. Oh, the horror on day 10. 30 meals. Oh my God, it must be agony. And yet you can do a water fast with the right mentality, and you'll be feeling on top of the world usually by the 3rd week, when before you could barely move. You had to have a cane to crawl. Now you're skipping and hopping around with more energy than ever. How can that be? Explain that one for me. Well, if you understood that fasting is no different than a caterpillar turned into a butterfly, you'd realize how miraculous fasting is. And if you understood the damage the chemicals have done, you'd realize that it can be dangerous for some of us, which is why we need to modify a water fast, and that's where my first step comes into play. So if you haven't done so yet, be sure to check out my seminar. And if you have watched it and you haven't decided to do it, well, what better time to do it than whenever you're ready? And if you're ready now, do it. And when you do, you're in for a treat.